Unacademy. Let's crack it.
Hello, dear UPSC aspirants. A very good evening and warm welcome to Unacademy UPSC Summit. So, before we start this important session, can you please let me know if I'm audible and clearly visible? Please let me know in the comments. Type yes or give me a thumbs up in the comment section. Great. Everything looks good. So, today's session is something which is very special for UPSC aspirants. Today, we have a very special guest, an eminent personality who shall be addressing you on a very important topic from international relations. So before we start the session, I would like to give you a brief introduction about the topic and as well as introduce the personality. See, in the world of international relations, it's often said that there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. In this pursuit of national interests, big powers, they often leverage their hard military and economic power to coerce and force other countries to act according to their interests. But few countries like India, they use a fine mix of hard power and soft power to secure their interests. Joseph Nye, the one who pioneered the theory of soft power, defines soft power as the ability to get what you want through attraction instead of using coercion and force. Today we have a very special guest in the house to help you understand whether India's soft power policy is still relevant. It's an absolute honor and my privilege to welcome Suhasini Haidar to Unacademy UPSC Summit for a thought-provoking session on this important topic. Suhasini Haidar needs no introduction, especially for civil services aspirants, because I'm sure all of you would have read her insightful articles and columns in The Hindu, which is one of the most reliable newspapers for UPSC aspirants. Currently, Suhasini Haidar serves as the diplomatic affairs editor at The Hindu, covering Indian foreign policy and global geopolitical developments. Suhasini Haidar also anchors a show at The Hindu titled World View with Suhasini Haidar, and I strongly urge all civil services aspirants to tune into this show for gaining valuable insights into India's foreign policy challenges and contemporary geopolitical developments. Prior to this, Suhasini Haidar has served as foreign affairs editor and prime-time anchor at CNN IBN and was also a correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi bureau. With a remarkable journalistic career spanning nearly 3 decades, Suhasini Haidar has covered some of the most challenging developments spanning diverse regions and even conflict zones. Her reporting extends from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka in our neighborhood, in our immediate neighborhood, to even Libya, Lebanon, and Syria in our extended neighborhood. Recently, Suhasini Haidar was also in Moscow covering PM Modi's landmark visit to Russia, which took place under challenging circumstances given the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is important to note that while reporting from internal conflict zones like Kashmir, Suhasini Haidar was also injured in a bomb blast in 2000. She was part of the CNN team that won the Columbia DuPont Broadcast Journalism Award in 2005 for the extensive coverage of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Suhasini Haidar even worked for CNN in New York during its coverage of the 9/11 attacks, a shocking event that redefined global geopolitical landscape. Suhasini Haidar is also a recipient of the prestigious Prem Bhatia Award for Excellence in Journalism. So it is our privilege to have such a distinguished personality to take a thought-provoking session on the relevance of India's soft power. I extend a hearty welcome to Suhasini Haidar, and I would like to hand over the session to you, ma'am. So just wait for a few seconds. Ma'am will join in, and the session is going to start very soon.
Okay. I think you can all see me, and I hope that you can. If you can't, I hope one of the organizers will send me a message loud and clear. Thanks so much for joining us, and I want to thank Unacademy for inviting me to speak to you about a subject that has always fascinated me as somebody who follows foreign policy, and it's something that also I think is not spoken about quite as much. Most people just assume that when you are talking about a country, when you're talking about a foreign policy, when you're talking about just what kind of impression a country makes in the world, that essentially those are tools of the state, those are tools of governance, that there isn't, there isn't a real science or a theory behind it. So I'm here to bust that myth and to talk, one, about soft power and what it means, but also about why so many think that soft power has become less relevant. I can say it possibly is less effective today, but it's certainly not less relevant. So let's just start by talking about what is soft power. And of course, the word power, I was once told in a class where we were learning how to control one's voice, that power is actually one of the most powerful words, because when you say the word, you actually put out a lot of energy into the world. So the idea that power itself is something that requires you to engage with the world. There are two types, of course, and there's always hard power. That's something you always hear about. In fact, power seems synonymous with hard power. Soft power sounds like a bit of a contradiction in terms. So let's just get to the technicalities. There's a very famous American political science and an author who actually wrote a book. He wrote his treatise called Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics. And for those of you who are interested in this subject, I certainly hope that you will read more about that as well. Now, Joseph Nye at this time had actually said very clearly that soft power is one of three ways in which a nation is able to effect a desired outcome in the international context. So in a sense, it is about getting your aims met, right? And what are those three ways in which, if you look just in terms of what Joseph Nye said, he said one is through military might, through threats and coercion. That's an obvious one that seems to be very current, in fact, today, to use military might to have people accept whatever you want them to accept or to do what you want them to do. The second, he said, through the use of economic and financial blandishments and sanctions. And then the third is, and those two really constitute a country's hard power. So what is the first is the one that is about using your military. The second is about using economic sanctions and the might of your economy. And the third part is what I talked about, which is the soft power. And he said there that then there's the use of soft power, an intangible mix of a country's culture, connectivity, governance, and freedoms that influences others into aligning themselves with its goals. He said, when you get others to admire your ideals and to want what you want, you do not have to spend as much time on sticks and carrots to move them in your direction. And then he went on to say, seduction is always more effective than coercion. It's also more long-term. And many values like democracy and human rights and individual opportunities are deeply seductive. So this is what Joseph Nye actually said, that you must use soft power because it is more effective. It's nicer, as they say, you catch more honeys with a fly, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. So, you know, the importance of soft power is what he was speaking about. And Joseph Nye was a big advisor in the US government, I think in the Clinton era in particular. Now, so we are now looking at what is soft power. Soft power has three parts to it. And this is now my summation of how I've seen countries use soft power. The first is something you'll already recognize, which is cultural. When a country's pop music, for example, or India's yoga, food, Tai Chi from China, for example, Italian food, Chinese food, Indian food. You see that kind of cultural message that, that countries send out to the world and say, this is our culture, but we're willing to share it with you. And then other countries, you go and you suddenly see yoga classes everywhere, or you see Bollywood dancing classes, or you see, people loving pizza and making pizza in places in the world where they haven't even heard of Italy. But that is important because it takes the name of a country far and wide, and people look at it with a certain amount of softness. The second, so the first is cultural. The second type of soft power is really about values and ideas. And there's some overlap with the first section, but values and ideas essentially means how a nation thinks. What is the nation's philosophy? You think about Plato and what he did for Greek philosophy in the world, or you think about Confucius, or you think about Indian scholars of so many sorts, of the Upanishads and the Vedas, and what they have done in a sense for the world, in terms of adding to people's ideas around the world. You think about things like religion, and by that I don't mean the cultural aspect of religion, and of course many religions have basically done very well around the world, but I'm talking about the ideology behind religion, the kind of philosophy underpinning Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity. They've all thrived outside of the place where they were actually first enshrined, where people first started to follow them. So you see a certain idea being able to spread around the world, and then you think, this is something that is coming from that country. And it is part of any country's soft power. Of course, India has a lot more soft power. It is the crucible of so many languages, but also so many religions. And many are religions that have thrived in India, even though they may have come up somewhere else. So that is the second, the power of values, the power of ideas that go abroad, and then they are identified with a country, and then you talk about the soft power of the country.
Hey everyone, before we go ahead with this video, I wanted to share some exciting news. The Unacademy UPSC subscription, whose plus courses have produced an impressive 70 plus selections in the UPSC CSE 2023, is currently available at an unbelievable pricing, which is 29,999 rupees. And this 12-month subscription offers comprehensive coverage of GS and CSAT, along with access to test series and unlimited batches in multiple language. But you need to hurry, as this is a limited period offer. So grab your subscription now and give a boost to your UPSC preparations. Now, let's get back to the video.
The third, and this is a little bit trickier than the other two, because the other two are fairly obvious. The third is aspirational, what Joseph Nye said. When people want what you want, when they have the same beliefs in how they want to take their country forward, or the idea that you have similar aspiration. So this third option is called aspiration. So you have cultural, you have values and ideas, and you have the third type of soft power, which is aspirational. They want to be like you. I certainly see it a lot in terms of India, that you'll go around the world, you'll see countries that have nothing in common actually with India, but they want to be like you. The United States, there are so many parts of the world where countries are completely different from the US, yet people want to leave in droves, some illegally, some legally, and live in America because they want to be like them. And you see it with several countries where there's an aspirational quality. It's not jealousy, it's not envy, it's not awe, it's not a kind of intimidation, it's aspirational. For India, for example, if you look in our neighborhood, and I've traveled a bit in the Indian subcontinent, you always hear people talking about what India represents to them, or some say represented to them in the last 75 years, that India is a democracy, that it is pluralistic, it is the single country in a sense in the region that has one dominant majority but has remained over 75 years essentially pluralistic and secular according to a constitution. It is rule abiding. It is not seen as a country that invades other countries, that projects power in other jurisdictions as well. The idea that India sees itself as a voice for the voiceless. You may have heard in the last couple of years a lot of talk about voice of the global south, but it's India's image in the world, where India spoke about countries, spoke about injustices, whether it was apartheid in South Africa, whether it was the post-World War order, helping Japan rebuild, helping countries like Austria win their freedom. India had a role in speaking up for those who could not speak for themselves. So that's always been seen as part of India's soft power, that it's a moral, that it's a principled power. Now, a lot will, slip between the cup and the lip, and not everything will be true. But at the end of the day, what you're looking at is a kind of image of a country that others want to be, that they look up to. More recently, quite right, as Dipankar said, during COVID time, there was a real, contrast, if you like, where you see a country, even like the United States, taking measures to protect COVID supplies for themselves. There were shipments going to neighboring countries, to the US, small little islands, and those shipments were stopped at the time because they said we need it. Whereas you had a country like India saying, we don't know, how long this is going to carry on, but we will be sharing our vaccinations, that we will be sharing medicines, that we will be sharing COVID, products to counter COVID, medical products, and all the rest of that. So those are all part of what becomes a country's ethos. It's how a country represents itself, and they become. So just to recap, those three types of soft power that I spoke about are cultural, dance, music, yoga, food, and that sort of thing, values and ideas, and those include philosophy, they include religion, they include language, and then the third, which is aspirational, that somebody just wants to be like you, wants to be a power like you. That means that you have power over other countries. Now, some exaggerate this kind of soft power. I've often felt, for example, we talk about the power of yoga. Power of yoga gives India a real entry in the world. There is no part of the country, part of the world that I've been to where you don't see somebody talking about yoga, for example. I've been to small towns in Central Asia, and they'll have a yoga studio. Does that mean that India gets a new kind of power there? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that the influence changes. For example, if you eat an Italian pizza, does that mean that now suddenly you are going to follow whatever Italy does? Not at all. So it's worth thinking about how much power you can project through soft power in that sense. But what it does do for you is it gives you an entry into various parts of the world. I always give people this example of showing up. You go any part of the world and people will say, oh, you're from India, here's a Bollywood song I know. Oh, you're from India, here's a dance step I've learned. Or language, they'll speak a little bit of language, or as I said, there'll be yoga. In 2011, I had gone to Libya to cover the impending NATO invasion there. Gaddafi was still in power. And I remember getting into my taxi and wondering how I was going to make any kind of, communication. And the man looked at me and said, where are you from? And I said, from India. And he straight away said to me, Nam. And I was really wondering, I said, I'm sure he is not speaking on non-alignment, for example. And then he, of course, spoke about Prime Minister Nehru. And again, I thought, maybe I'm not understanding what he's trying to say. As we drove, he started pointing to a building. He'd taken me around to look at a building. And there on the side of the building was a mural with all the leaders of the 60s on it. And there was Prime Minister Nehru was there. And he kept saying, this is what India is known for. Now, where do you expect? In various parts of the world, you'll go and you'll suddenly see, in Israel, I think more recently, Prime Minister Modi's photo was part of a campaign, a political campaign. It's essentially because of what India is able to project to the world. Quite right, Roger, when you talk about Raj Kapoor in Russia, there's a restaurant in Tashkent called Raj Kapoor. It's just called Raj Kapoor. The whole menu has pictures of him. And I don't think the owners have really engaged with India, more recently, although there are lots of tourists who go there. But this idea remains. I've been on a train from Beijing to Tibet, and they see me and they start to sing, a 1960s song. In fact, I was more interested that a few years ago I went to Xinjiang, and the school students, were much more interested in Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan and those songs. So you see that, and I don't want to spend too much time dwelling on what kind of soft power India has in the world, but it is a mixture of all three of those. It's not just the idea of culture that goes around the world. That's the basic point I was trying to make. However, there is an idea that in the world today, and even in India, that soft power is meant for wimps. That soft power, in a sense, is not so effective in the world. That eventually, look around you in the world. People are essentially doing what they can. The famous parable of the strong will do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. That's supposed to be the definition of realpolitik. And this is from, a Greek philosopher way back. Now, the idea that the majority or the big brute force in the world, those with power, are able to somehow, get their way, achieve their goals, is gaining currency in the world. And the world goes through these kind of cycles. So I want to talk a little bit about why this question, because the question that's been put to us by the Unacademy people is the relevance. It's about the relevance of soft power. So when they say that why is it that soft power is not doing so well, I certainly do see that people are looking at soft power less as a means of of reaching their ends in terms of reaching out to the world. If in the post-World War era, so the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, then the breakdown of the Soviet Union, it seemed as if it was essentially the breakdown had come because people wanted a more global culture. The advent of globalization, of global structures, the UN Security Council, the WTO, the WHO, so many different international multilateral bodies, then globalization in terms of the economics, then globalization that exploded in terms of television, and the fact that today you just turn on your computer and you can get a film or a TV serial from any part of the world. Those kind of ideas of globalization seem to suggest that we were moving into an era where soft power would mean much more. We saw that for several decades. However, in this century, I think since the beginning of this century, we have seen that resolve come into certain doubts. There's a perception that soft power's efficacy is very much in decline. And I think it is essentially for a number of reasons. One is the rejection of soft power by the global leaders themselves. So one problem is what the global leaders are doing in terms of polarization, the polarization between global powers. And I'll explain that a little bit. The second is the rise of populism, the way leaders are getting elected in democracies, particularly because it's democracies whose ideas go much more outside. Authoritarian countries tend to keep themselves inside, if a little more. So the second is the rise of populism. The third is, in a sense, the militarization of diplomacy. We're seeing a lot more hard power being used in our diplomacy. And finally, the idea that the big powers in the world are not an exemplar. They're not a good example, really, for the world. Joseph Biden, when he came to power in the US a few years ago, said, we must lead by the power of our example rather than the example of our power. So rather than showing you our power, we should be the power of example that you would wish to follow. So let's just break that up a little bit. As I said, there are three big reasons that I see, or four big reasons that I see a kind of a decline in the power of soft power, in a sense. The first, if you look at the polarization of the world since 2022 and the Ukraine war and what Russia did over there, there is a sense now that might is right, that essentially that countries that have the power are able to do things. Israel's operations in Gaza is another case in point. China's strong arming of aggressive tactics when it comes to the South China Sea. We're seeing an increase in that. With that, what is increasing is the growing sense of polarization in the world. So if the end of the 19th century was the 20th century was essentially about globalization, this century has been much more about deglobalization. It began perhaps in 2008 with the big stock exchange collapses around the world. But what we've seen is more and more people are not comfortable with the idea of globalization. There is a sense that they have suffered economically. There's a sense that foreigners are coming into their countries. There's a real xenophobia against immigration. You see this in the US election as well. So that kind of idea that the world is actually coming apart a little bit. What did we see with COVID? Was the entire idea that every country was just shutting down their borders and dealing with their own people and not wanting outsiders to come in, right? I'm not saying these are good or bad. I'm just saying that this is the trend that we're seeing. With the Ukraine war, Russia unilaterally going into Ukraine, not listening to anybody. Then you see the Western countries saying, okay, now that you've gone into Ukraine, we're going to cut Russia out of the SWIFT system, so no credit card payments. Western businesses will shut down in Russia. Russians will not be able to travel. In fact, Western airliners don't even fly over Russia, even though it takes much less time now because of that. Cutting all kinds of cultural reactions, all kinds of ideas that where you might have seen Russians in other parts of the West and Westerners in Russia. Tourism has gone. Television stations, they've cut down each other's television stations. You just don't see. I remember this idea that there was, I think, a Philharmonic orchestra conductor in Europe, and he was asked to denounce the government in Russia or else lose his job. So you see the liberal world order, also all these liberal values, really coming down. So we are seeing more and more this idea that there is a kind of polarization in powers. You see it in India too, where we have had an issue with another country, like Pakistan, for example. India's answer in the last 5 years has been, we don't need to talk. We don't need visas with each other. We don't want music and dance coming across the boundaries. We don't want films and film stars to be crossing the boundary. Again, I'm not saying this is a yes or a no or correct or not correct. I'm saying this essentially as an idea that now people are not looking so much at soft power. They're looking at a more polarized kind of answer. Okay, so then you see that as one of the big reasons why there has been this kind of decline in soft power's relevance. The second, as I said, is this rise of populism. Populism essentially means a kind of phenomenon which we're seeing in a lot of countries. They are anti-elitist, anti-pluralistic, anti-immigrants, that kind of idea. But we're seeing them coming up in a lot of democracies where there are big majorities, big what we call alpha men leaders around the world, and I don't need to name them, there are so many, who are essentially driving these ideas once again of xenophobia, anti-globalization, wanting to do protection. When the US says that we should only build chips in America, or manufacturing of EVs must happen only in America. India has that version too. We have Make in India, we have Atmanirbhar. Other countries also are saying we don't really want to send our money abroad. We want everything to happen inside our country. These are all factors of what we are seeing as more populist governments around the world. And it's not just India and the US, so many countries are now turning much more protectionist, the UK as well. So that's the second idea. I think the third is self-explanatory, that what we are seeing is essentially diplomacy. Sorry, Mahima asked, what does xenophobia mean? Xenophobia means the fear of foreigners. And I'm sorry, I know a lot of you are saying I should say this in Hindi. Next time I'll prepare better and do the whole lecture in Hindi. But for the moment, bear with the English. And if you have any questions, of course, please do get in touch. It's essential in a sense to speak in the language where you have prepared yourself a little better. Thank you. So to move on, there was this idea that we are becoming more military in our diplomacy. If you look at some of the talks that India now does, there's always military component to your talks with any other country. And more what we are seeing is it is there in every sphere of diplomacy. Of course, there is the very positive kind of soft power that comes out of it, things like HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. When there is a problem, when there's a tsunami, it's the Indian military that goes out and helps the neighbors. That was in 2004. But since then, so many different calamities have occurred in our neighborhood, a little further out, and the Indian Navy has been pressed in, or the Indian Air Force has been pressed in. This is apart from us bringing back our own people from different countries where there's a calamity. So there is a militarization of diplomacy in many ways, and that is essentially also moving soft power into the hard power game. So you see an irrelevance of soft power because more conversations are being held on the military front as well. Nothing again wrong with that, but it is a trend that you must watch. And I think the fourth is really this idea of example. What I said, this might is right. The idea that the people right at the top of the world structure are no longer behaving as they should. They are no longer countries that we would aspire to, in a sense. When the US invades another country, when Russia invades another country, when China invades another country, and basically says, I can do this because I have the might. What it's doing around the world is saying, therefore, that soft power doesn't count. It's making soft power less relevant. And that is essentially a big problem. When you have countries saying that we will do whatever we want to inside our country, forget all these international human rights or what we've seen as crackdowns on human rights in different parts of the world, in China, in Europe, in fact, India is accused of that as well. So we see a little bit of that. Now, if the world's leadership behaves like this, so the P5, as they're called, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, supposed to be the most powerful, or the G7, the richest countries of the world, when they start taking part in these very unilateral gestures, when they start taking part in essentially power play around the world, what it does is it says that soft power of a country is less and less important. This new kind of Cold War that we have between various countries, where culturally we disconnect from each other, that is also hitting soft power a little bit. Now, what does this essentially mean for India? And I think it's particularly important because India has always been a country that has relied on its soft power to project its hard power. So in a sense, from the very beginning, from 1947, the idea has always been that India has been able to punch above its weight. That's a phrase you always hear about India, which India is able to punch above its weight and say things. Recently, Prime Minister Modi went to Austria. And while he was there, the Chancellor of Austria said to him, India is a very important country because India helped Austria win its freedom. And it gave Austria its most important philosophy, which is neutrality. And that's because in the 1950s, India was called upon, Prime Minister Nehru was called upon to come and help and to press upon the Soviet Union the importance of giving Austria its independence. Now, you see, that happened in the 1950s. 70 years later, India still has a bump when you go to Austria because of that history. And as a result, India's position in the world has also always been a little more than it would be if you were to just look at India in economic terms, per capita income terms, in terms of development, in terms of technology, in terms of how much it has been able to bridge the divides within the country, the economic inequalities and all that. Compared to all of that, India's position in the world is a very important one. And I think that there are maybe three places really where you particularly see them, and you're absolutely right, Pratham, that the Indian diaspora is one big factor. Simply because Indians have gone around the world, assimilated into other cultures, joined other cultures, become a part of other countries. And of course, India doesn't give dual citizenship, so they become citizens of other countries. But they are able to, as a result, give India a certain name, give India a certain soft power in the world. It's a very important, addition to India's power. Yet it's very important not to weaponize it. You see the difference? That you use the power of the diaspora, but you don't weaponize it. Because when we have seen countries like Israel or China use their diaspora and then use them to lobby for things or use them as a symbol of their force in another country, that's when soft power goes into decline. So the diaspora is certainly one important area where India needs to see. The second is really India's soft power as a country that is willing to be the voice of the voiceless. In other words, working for a greater good. Now, you saw this with the Ukraine war, where India was able to say that we understand that there is a war, we understand there's a backlash to the war, but look at the global majority. It's very interesting that in 2022, in the UN General Assembly, 140 countries voted to criticize Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. But only about 40 countries have actually joined the sanctions against Russia. What does that eventually mean? It means that this huge population of the world, 100 countries at least, who are essentially saying we don't want to be a part of the global power games. And for India to take responsibility and a kind of leadership of that is very important. So that's the second area where India must use its soft power as the voice of the voiceless, as a country that speaks up for others, and make soft power more relevant rather than irrelevant. And I think the third is in the idea of an India that is an aspirational force for other countries. When you go around in the region, when you go to many parts of the world, people will actually say, you know, India is such a great democracy. I wish we were more like India. Even countries where they don't have democracies, where they have military dictatorships, so they have authoritarian regimes, will say we would like to be like India in terms of India's democracy. And I think the last election has really enthused people around the world who look at India as a kind of model for themselves. We're watching the US elections as well, and we're seeing how much trouble that they are having going into that election campaign. The other part of that is really India's pluralism. The idea that India is this massive country, largest population in the world, and is still able to remain pluralistic. It has so many languages, and yet it's able to bridge those divides. It has so many religions, it has so many cultures, so many ethnicities. So it remains a pluralistic country. And the third, as I said, is that the idea that India remains a rule-abiding country. It does not invade, it does not aggress, it deals with aggression. And that's why India's hard power is important, a deterrent power as well as a counter power to those who do try to aggress. But essentially, India is not the first aggressor. So those are the three reasons why it's important to continue India's path. Whether it is to keep yourself, and some of you have written, and I agree with you, it's important for India to speak up for itself, to have its hard power in the world. But it's essentially its soft power that will make India's voice much louder, and as I said, become a sort of power that punches far above what others would think its weight is. So I'm going to stop over here, and I want to quickly look through some of your questions. It's certainly been interesting because I've been just glancing over them through the entire through this entire episode. So I'm just going to go right to the top. And then I'll come down. Hold on. Here we go. I'm seeing a lot of video issues that happened at the beginning. Which is why, correct. A lot of you have given examples of how India's soft power has gone in the world. One question from Adi is: are soft powers just complementary to hard power of coercion, as most realists say? That's a good question, Adi. But the fact is that you don't. That if you can use soft power first, then you don't need to use hard power. And that's what I think even Joseph Nye was trying to say with saying that essentially the power of seduction is much greater than the power of coercion. Okay, let's just see what other questions have. Saurabh says, ultimately hard power prevails. We can witness this with the example of the Russia-Ukraine war. You're right, Saurabh, but it is a cynical view of how the world should prevail because it's not the version of the world that was created after the last World War. When they said never again, when they said that they set up the United Nations to ensure that international values were followed, then the hope was that you would not have this kind of hard power prevailing, that eventually what you will see is a softening or at least a moderation of many of these. Sports players, you're quite right, Rahul, Sports is very much a part of our soft power. Hold on. Agravat, it says, currently Pakistan will be a temporary member of the UN Security Council. How will India treat that? I think Pakistan will join in 2025. And it's a rotating position. India has been there so many times for a period of 2 years, and it's an elected position. I think India will have to use both its soft power and its hard power in terms of its diplomacy in order to ensure that its interests are not hurt at the United Nations. But I don't think that this is something unexpected. This is something that we can easily prepare for. Many requests about Hindi, and I really do apologize for that. Is any relevance of soft power left after India became a developed country? You know, the truth is that development itself becomes an element of soft power, and people look at the way you develop, because it's no longer about how much you sell, you know, how big is your market, how much is your manufacturing. It is about the way that you are able to build your economy and be a developed economy. Is it an economy which will just be, you know, doing a kind of value add and assembling cell phones, that kind of economy? Or are you going to be an economy where you are creating jobs, you are building a better environment, building better business practices, bridging a lot of the divides, not just economic, but also digital, between your people, in order to become a developed country? And that's what gets you soft power more than the others. PM Modi has received a number of high-value awards, and recently Russia honored him, certainly, and he's always accepted it on behalf of India, saying this is a recognition of what India represents in the world, in Bhutan as well. All right. Ringsell says, being self-sufficient, yes, it's absolutely a power of example that people look at. How will deglobalization occur? Asked Pratham. A very good question, because many are talking about it right now. The idea that every country just wants to kind of produce in their own country is essentially a kind of push against globalization, because global supply chains are in doubt. So instead, what we're seeing much more of is people looking for resilient global supply chains and saying that I will take my supplies from countries with whom I have a certain comfort level. Now look around in the world, many of those supply chains are actually regional supply chains. That is an area where India is in fact lagging behind, because our region is not very well connected. The SAARC region, as it is called, we do intra-regional trade of only about 5%. Whereas you look around the world, in the European Union, about 60% of their trade is done inside their region. In the US, they have something called USMCA. They do a lot internally. South America has Mercosur. Now there's this new RCEP that takes in China, Japan, Australia. It takes in all of the ASEAN countries. And what it looks like is a lot of the trade will happen within those countries as well. So the first part of this deglobalization is an increase in regionalization. The second is the big question, which I think has not yet been answered, which is about de-dollarization. Or are we going to look at different ways of paying in national currencies and not use the dollar as the standard? We're certainly seeing that between India and Russia, and after Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to Moscow, I think there'll be more of that. So that is another question, although most think that it is not really feasible to do any kind of de-dollarization. But the idea that, you know, for example, in October, President Putin will be hosting a BRICS summit. One of the conversations is about whether you can have a BRICS currency just for the 10 countries that are now in BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And just those countries, which are amongst the world's leading emerging economies, if they are going to look at a currency on their own, that would be a real blow. So for the moment, I don't think deglobalization will be easy. And I'm not even sure it's happening, but I'm certainly seeing a trend in the narrative on that. Osho says, UK soft power, that whole world is speaking their language like right now. Yes, that's absolutely true. It is the language of instruction as well. So we are seeing much more of that. Question of economic coupling due to strategic interest is what Roger has said. And I think that is important because we're seeing it in India. When you speak about Pakistan, we have zero trade ties with them or direct trade ties with them. Even though India-Pakistan trade has a potential, everyone always says, of billions of dollars every year, simply because we have so much, the costs are so much less if India and Pakistan were to do trade with each other. But right now, because of the diplomatic situation between them, because of hard power really taking over from soft power, we're not doing that. We are, however, with China, where there is also a military standoff, increasing our trade. In fact, as of May, I think China became India's biggest trading partner once again. So you're seeing examples of some places where India has worked a certain way and some places where it has not. However, even with China, if you look, some of the components of soft power, like tourism, is completely right now non-existent. Flights between the two countries not happening. Well, the students are now increasingly going. Akanksha points out India's work in the Turkey earthquake, and I certainly agree with it. Dipankar points to External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's message that Europe's problems are not the world's problems, but essentially that's what Europe was hoping to do. Harshit asks, ma'am, the low rank of India in various global indexes, don't you think it puts a question on our soft power? Why are these rankings so biased? I think firstly, all of these rankings are very difficult because, are very difficult to believe and their credibility, only because it's so difficult to gauge abstract ideas like how good is a democracy. You can say a democracy, if you just look at democracy from the point of view of elections. Okay, so if you hold elections, you should be fine. But to put more labels on the democracy, what is the quality of a country's democracy? These are very, very relative terms. And I think it's very difficult for any global index to actually tell you. But where I think we should pay attention is on the year on year. So if India has been judged well in a certain section, whether it is on press and freedom rights, whether it is on inequality, whether it is on democracy and human rights, and then it is not graded as well, then it's worth looking because it's a comparison that is logical. But I find otherwise this idea of comparing one country against another is completely illogical, and I don't think we should set too much store by it. The problem is we spend a lot of our time looking at a lot of these rankings against another country and say, how is it that a country like Afghanistan has a higher rank than India? It is illogical, but it's important to see where year on year India is in a trend either going down. Then you need to see why it is doing that.
Hey everyone, before we go ahead with this video, I wanted to share some exciting news. The Unacademy UPSC subscription, whose plus courses have produced an impressive 70 plus selections in the UPSC CSE 2023, is currently available at an unbelievable pricing, which is 29,999 rupees. And this 12-month subscription offers comprehensive coverage of GS and CSAT, along with access to test series and unlimited batches in multiple language. But you need to hurry as this is a limited period offer. So grab your subscription now and give a boost to your UPSC preparations. Now, let's get back to the video.
How can India's soft power impact Sino-India? Very interesting question, Aditya. I wish I knew why India and China's soft power has not really worked, because the two countries have, over the centuries, had so many exchanges between them, whether it was on Buddhism, whether it's been on philosophy, whether it's been on the Silk Route and the trade. But it does not seem to change the fact that right now China is India's biggest threat, and there is a standoff at the line of actual control. Can soft power help? Soft power must be allowed to help if you want that, and for that maybe this is not the time, but certainly you will have to see, as with Pakistan, more travel between the two countries, a greater understanding. Should India use hard power in dealing with China on the issue of LAC and SCS? But I think those are two separate issues. With LAC, absolutely, India has to show its hard power. It has to show its ability to deter the other country across the boundary, to deter China from further aggressive acts. But when it comes to the South China Sea, India has traditionally maintained its primacy in the Indian Ocean region, not so much in the Pacific Ocean, not so much in the South China Sea. Certainly, if India is called upon to help by a certain country, then that changes complexities, but not otherwise. Ringsell says India has always relied on soft power to project its hard power. That I think is true. And India is one of those really rare cases of countries that have been able to do an effective use of its soft power in that sense. Pratham spoke about Indian diaspora, quite right. Pragyan says quiet oceans have strong waves and a current like that. India is in terms of soft power, absolutely below the surface. Very, very old civilization, very, very old culture. Kaushal is asking if I actually read these books. Yes, all the books on the shelf behind me I've certainly read. And if you watch Worldview at The Hindu every week, we put it out. We actually give you specific book recommendations on a certain subject. So if you do enjoy reading, it's certainly good to follow all of those. If I'm correct, Rahul asks, it was the first time the Indian PM after winning the election went to a foreign country rather than neighboring countries. That's correct. And the question is why? Why is India's soft power or the kind of relationship it has in the neighborhood not ensured that the Prime Minister went there first? I'm sure that they will make up for it. Aditya asked, when it comes to choose between strategic autonomy versus our legacy of soft power, which one is more important? You know, the interesting thing, Aditya, is that India's strategic autonomy is part of its soft power. It is something, I mean, we did hear from the US ambassador last week saying in a conflict, there's no such thing as soft power. But India has shown, there's no such thing as strategic autonomy, excuse me, but India has shown that it is a believer in strategic autonomy, and whether it's been the Ukraine war, whether it's been so many other issues in the world, India has shown that it is able to walk the tightrope and keep its autonomy when it comes to diplomacy. And I think that actually makes it a power to aspire to for a lot of other countries. And a lot of other countries are also saying that they would like strategic autonomy as a result. Countries like France, even in the West, speak much more about that. Laurie has asked, is there a significant correlation between the efficacy of back channel diplomacy and the country's soft power? Back channel diplomacy is not really connected to soft power because it is it's really about essentially working behind the scenes, whereas soft power is all about projecting yourself, even if you do it subtly, in front of the scenes. Well, Ringsell makes a point that India as a leader of the oppressed and marginalized nations that image is gradually declining. It's certainly about India's priorities. If that priority remains, then India will find that its role in the emerging global order will come back. And Niharika finally says it's an unrelated topic, but in your opinion, will India's multi-alignment policy eventually lead to problematic situations for India in the long run? I certainly agree, Niharika, and it's not disconnected because all of the power we're speaking about really exists because India has to constantly choose between all these conflicting forces in the world. And as the world gets more polarized, as I was speaking about, as countries start to say, you have to choose. What was the US ambassador saying essentially when he said that in conflict, there's no strategic autonomy? We need to know where you stand. We need to know you're a friend and a partner. And that essentially coming from both sides, you know, Prime Minister Modi goes to Moscow, there's criticism in the West. Prime Minister Modi doesn't go to Russia, and there's a sense that the India-Russia relationship is suffering, and Russia is getting closer to China. So consistently, I think India has to constantly assert this multi-alignment policy. It's not something that you can just say, I'm sitting, on a tightrope and I refuse to move no matter what happens. I think where India can choose to perhaps engage both sides, I'm not saying as a mediator, but as partners of India, where India is able to explain its position, I think that is always very helpful. Ashutosh asks if growing right-wing politics is a result of the irrelevance of soft power. Certainly, right-wing politics, any part of the world, any extremist policy is always going to be connected to hard power rather than soft power. So that's definitely there. Sarthak, India can change its soft power by promoting sports of greater fan following, like football. I know that cricket gets an inordinate amount of India's time and priority, and most Indians are excited about it. But yes, there are other games that India could push as well. And I'm going to take this last question from Vishal, because we're certainly running out of time, where he says India's motto of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam can be a breach of its own motto if it uses hard power. Well, I certainly think that the idea of India in a global context, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, essentially means that the world is one village. And by the way, this is something that's been enshrined in India's foreign policy since 1946, even before independence. We had the then interim Prime Minister, Nehru, speaking in Parliament, and he said, these are what will be India's foreign policy principles. And in it, he said that the world is one village. It was a big part of it. So they were talking about globalization way back then. Deglobalization is certainly going to make it more difficult for India to project soft power, because soft power works on the idea that you are engaging with other countries in a softer context when it comes to power. I think that is really what we have time for. I'm getting a message to say we are running out of time over here. But I do want to take an extra moment to thank you, to thank all of you, not just because you joined the session today, but because of your reading of the Hindu and the amazing amount of criticism, amazing amount of feedback that I received. It's certainly an inspiration for me when I open, a Twitter account or another social media account or my email and receive a reply. Some of you don't even reply. You just take the articles we write and color them in different pens, showing us that you're using the points very systematically. It's very helpful. So all I would say is that please keep your feedback coming in. Please tell us how better the situation, because at the end of the day, diplomacy, foreign policy, all of these aspects are really about reaching out to others. So we have completed this 1 hour over here. I do hope you enjoyed it, talking about the relevance and possibly the challenges to soft policy. And from the team, as well as from me, Suhasini Haidar, I'd like to thank you all. Namaste.
Unacademy. Let's crack it.